Welcome all to PCU. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you an old game of mine that I played in my early years of my career, and I thought it may be a good way to share with you some ideas, what to watch out for and what to avoid. Well, here is the game. Here we go. I had the black pieces while my opponent was white, and he started the game by playing e4, and in those days I pretty much always responded with the French defense. The reason why I did like that in my early years, because it immediately, right on the first move, determines what opening it is, and I'm in control of it. So I don't need to worry about a choice of openings, like for example, if you would start the game with e5, you need to be aware that white can respond with the king's gambit, which can lead to a very sharp game, or they can play more conservatively with knight f3 and then a number of choices after that, or to play knight c3, or to play the Danish gambit with d4, or to play bishop c4. Now, all of these moves that I just laid out can lead to a very specific and different type of positions, which if you're not familiar with at all, there are some little tricks that you can get in danger with. So, even though openings are not terribly important in the early stages of your chess playing, it's nice to be aware of the options and nice to be comfortable with the opening moves that you're dealing with. So here I chose the e6 move, and pretty much until I was rated around 1900 or 2000, that was the only thing I used to play exclusively, because right here black already determined that it's the French defense, and white pretty much is a lot more limited in their options, and black is the one dictating the pace, at least for now. My opponent responded with developing the knight to f3, which is already a slightly inferior move, to immediately occupying the center with the second pawn and playing d4. So he played instead knight f3, and the whole purpose of playing e6 on the first move is to then follow it up by occupying the center, playing d5. Now, when you see such a situation, regardless of the opening, and every single move, you need to ask yourself the question, why did my opponent make this move? And the question should be, does he want to capture any of my pieces? Or in some cases, does he or she want to checkmate me? Well, obviously, it's very, very rare that a checkmate danger would arise after only 2 moves, but as of capturing pieces, it may happen very, very early, as it does here. Right now, the black pawn is about to capture the white pawn on e4, and white, therefore, needs to react to that. And generally, there are number of ways to react to an attack, whether it's an attack to a piece or even if your king is in check. Well, the most obvious one is to run away, to move the attacked piece. Like in this case, that move could be simply to advance the pawn ahead to e5. Another option is to capture the piece that is attacking us. In this case, that would be capturing on d5, and probably that would be my favorite choice at this option. Or another option is to protect the piece that has been attacked by one of our other pieces. Well, can you think of ways how we can protect the pawn on e4 with one of the other pieces? Well, white can choose either to do that with a knight, developing to c3, or the way my opponent continued, protecting it with another pawn. Generally, it doesn't look bad to protect it with a pawn. However, in this particular case, it allows a sequence for black that will favor the black side because, as you shall see, if white wants to avoid losing material, they'll have to give up on their right to castle for this game. So I continued by trading pawns on e4, and if white doesn't want to stay a pawn down, they better recapture. And now I exchanged the queens on d1. What happens in this situation when white is unable to recapture with any other piece but their king? In fact, that is white's only move. Then after king d1, as we know, once the king moves, it can no longer ever castle within that same game. And that is a small advantage for black, because that means that black has more options left in this game. Of course, even though the queens are off the board, nothing has changed. It's time to develop the pieces, and that's exactly what I did. Moreover, developing by gaining a tempo. What does that mean? Gaining a tempo means that you're keeping your opponent busy, don't allowing your opponent to do whatever his or her plan may be. But your opponent is busy reacting to an attack that you just created. In this case, the attack is again on that poor e4 pawn. And again, just like in the previous scenario on move 2, white has options either to run away or to bring help to protect. Generally, it's a matter of taste, although there are times when one is simply just better than the other. In this case, advancing the pawn, even though it looks like a good option since it attacks immediately black's knight, it wouldn't be a great choice, because then that knight again would move away by immediately creating serious threats by capturing the pawn on f2, which in turn, if the black knight shows up there, will create a fork on the white king and rook. White cannot use any of his pieces to protect the pawn real well, because the only option would be to move the bishop to e3, which of course would allow black to trade, and then in turn would force white in having double pawns on the e file. So black would accumulate little advantages by stripping white from more and more options for the rest of the game. When you have two pawns on the same file, that means that the pawn that's in behind, that is less flexible and a lot more limited in movement. On the other hand, if instead the bishop move, white tries to protect the pawn with the king, even though the king is back to its initial square, the king still cannot castle, as we mentioned earlier. But now the real problem is that the black bishop develops to c5, and all of a sudden, between the black knight and bishop, both targeting the same f2 pawn, white is helpless. White will end up losing at least a pawn. Let's go back again. And the position after knight f6, white now needs to protect the pawn rather in a different way. And my opponent chose to protect the pawn with his knight. I think I would prefer to do the same with the bishop rather. So just in case I need to protect the pawn on f2, my rook will be also available to do so. Game continued with knight c3, and now immediately I looked for a way not only to develop my bishop, but immediately gain time again, gain a tempo, which means that now I indirectly threaten that same e4 pawn again. Why? Because if white is careless, then I will just capture the knight on c3, the very knight that was protecting the pawn on e4, exchanging a 3-point piece for another 3-point piece, and then the pawn on e4 will remain unprotected and the pawn will be gone and history. Remember that generally it's a very good thing if you can keep your opponent busy with targeting his or her pieces, while at the same time you're accomplishing your own goals, which in the early part of the game is to develop your pieces in a centralized way. If right now White would try to attack with knight b5, as so often these early attacks do not bring the desired result, Black could simply protect the pawn on c7, and then on the next move, let's say when White develops and protects his pawn on e4, Black would be ready to chase that knight back with c6, and the knight wouldn't have really accomplished anything. Let's go back again to the game position where my opponent protected the pawn with the bishop by playing bishop d3. However, this allowed the option for me to trade the bishop for the knight and force the ruining of the pawn structure of the white pawns on the queen side. As you can see now, White's a2 pawn, c2 pawn, and c3 pawn are all isolated, and the pawns on the c file are doubled. Of course, I had to pay a little price for that, namely that I no longer have both my bishops. And the reason why it's so nice to have both bishops, because together, as a pair, they can control combined all squares of the chessboard. On the other hand, Black, that was me in this game, is a little weak on the dark squares. So, generally speaking, when you trade a bishop for a knight but create double pawns for your opponent, it's a wash. There are several openings when both sides can choose to go for it, and usually it just creates an unbalanced situation, not necessarily better for one side of another. Okay, so let's continue. In this game, back in those days, which was a long time ago, I played knight c6. Today, being more experienced, I would probably castle right away, putting my king to safety. I proceeded by playing knight c6, and here my opponent developed his dark squared bishop, the last minor piece that's not yet developed. Try to think, where would you bring your bishop right now? Well, the bishop can develop to many different squares. However, there is one that's the most natural one. I would like the bishop on a3. What do you think the reason for that is? Well, the reason is because when a piece, an enemy piece, guards any of the squares that the king would need to pass towards castling, that prevents the other side from actually doing just that. So at this point, because the white bishop guards the f8 square, castling is not allowed. So therefore, I think a3 is a pretty ideal square for that bishop. Another square that I think would have been a better choice also than what my opponent chose was to move the bishop to f4. As you can see, right now, the bishop is targeting the pawn on c7, which I would have needed to attend to. So therefore, White certainly didn't choose the best option when he moved the bishop to b2. It's quite visible that the bishop right now is behind the pawn on c3, and therefore it's not at its most active position. Finally, I castled, and I think at this point White has to be careful not to get into serious trouble, and my opponent wasn't careful enough. Right now he played h3, preventing from my knight getting to g4, which is still okay. I responded with playing rook d8, and now this is a very important moment of the game. As usual, I suggest at every single move, look out, what does your opponent want to do? And I'll pause for a moment, trying to give you a moment to figure out what the threat is. Hopefully you found the correct answer to that, and the threat is Black capturing the pawn on e4. because the bishop on d3 right now is pinned. Apparently my opponent didn't notice that threat and ignored what I wanted to do. My opponent played g4 at this moment. Now putting that move back for a moment, if you realize that that is the threat, the knight wants to capture the pawn on e4, you realize what white should do. Well, there are a couple of ways to deal with it. One is to bring help, for example, the rook to e1, protecting the pawn, or another option is simply moving the king out of the pin, for example, by playing king e2. My opponent played g4, which is clearly a big mistake, because the response is using the pin, namely knight captures pawn. See how now the bishop is unable to capture the knight because it would leave the king under attack, that is in check. Now my opponent moved the king to e2, seemingly only protecting the pawn on f2 that was attacked. However, it's a sneakier move than that. While at the same time white protected the pawn, white also moved out of the pin. What does that mean? It means that the bishop is no longer in a pin and therefore is about to capture my knight. I shouldn't let that happen. Luckily I noticed it and moved my knight away. Of course the knight can move to various squares. Going to c5 is certainly not a bad choice. At that time I chose the knight to move to d6. It's certainly a safe square for my knight, and I had something in mind that you'll see in just a minute. My opponent activated the rook, definitely a very reasonable one, and I played e5, which is certainly a good choice, again creating a threat for my opponent, which he again ignored. Try to figure out what may have been my idea behind this move. Yes, of course. Indeed, it is to make a fork by advancing my pawn. And white at this stage should have moved his knight to g5 or to d2, preventing the advancement of the pawn by controlling the e4 square yet another time. The move my opponent chose instead, playing c4, is a serious mistake, because it allows the advancement of my pawn again, and as you can see it creates a double attack, which we also call as a fork. Importantly, the pawn on e4 is protected by the black knight on d6. Now white cannot avoid losing a piece. My opponent moved the knight to e5, which allowed me to capture the other piece, the bishop. And now white is in serious trouble and is about to lose even more material. The least of the damage that white could have gotten away with is to capture black with a knight right now. Instead, he chose to capture with the rook, but that left the white knight on e5, where it could be pinned again. And here I had a pleasant choice between immediately pinning the knight with my rook, which I chose, and it was even better to first trade and to create the pin afterwards. And if the bishop gets protected by f4, then the pin is used by f6, and now when the pawn attacks the bishop cannot run away, because that would leave the king under attack again. Let's go back and see the position after rook captured d3, and I played rook e8, creating the pin. Here, a better option for my opponent was to avoid losing the knight, instead of playing king f3, to play rook to e3. So the game continued with king f3, and then I could simply capture the knight because I have two attackers on it, a knight and the rook, while only a bishop is protecting. Naturally, the knight captures first, so I lose the lower value piece of the two. Not the rook, but rather the knight. Bishop captured, otherwise white was in a fork. The king is attacked as well as the rook, so to avoid losing further material, my opponent captured with the bishop, rook captured back, and my opponent played king f4. Well, if we do a count at this point, we'll notice that I have already an extra bishop and an extra knight, which obviously is a very significant material advantage, especially when we're talking about an endgame and the queens are off the board. I followed with rook e4, check, winning yet another pawn and attacking the one on c2. And here my opponent set a trap, and it's never too late to go wrong and to make a mistake. If right now I would have been greedy and would have captured the pawn on c2, my opponent could have won a piece back by capturing my knight, and then if pawn takes rook, all of a sudden I'm the one getting checkmated. No, 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 I do not like that at all. Luckily, even though I was still pretty young when I played this game, in fact I was only 6 years old, not yet 7, I noticed the threat and the danger and avoided it. If I would have instead played knight e4 check, that wouldn't have been good either, because my opponent, again for the same reason, could have captured my knight on e4 because of the back rank problem I'm facing. Let's go back, and I played a very careful move that takes care of all trouble. Of course, instead I could have just developed my bishop doing the same, avoiding the back rank problems. But by playing h6, I prevent it for good. There can be no accident, no more danger. The king will always have a little window to escape on h7. I suggest you try to do that in your own games. Make sure you avoid any danger for the back rank checkmate. And my opponent continued with rook e2, protecting his pawn on c2. And now I decided to develop my bishop on the long diagonal by playing b6, following it up with bishop b7. Of course, on a higher level, grandmasters would resign by now, but if you're a novice player, I suggest it's a good idea to play out such games so you know how to convert material advantage to checkmate to the full point. Came f3, and I played f5, setting another trap. If my opponent trades the pawns right now on f5, my knight will recapture, and that will create a fork on the white king and rook. My opponent played rook to e7, and of course there are many good ways to play here, but I chose to play f4 check, king f2, and king f8. One of white's problems is that white has nothing to target. Everything is very solid in black's position. Everything is protected. White played rook e5, and I continued with rook c3. Now the pawn is hanging on f3. As we can see, the bishop and the rook are cooperating nicely in targeting the f3 pawn, and there's nothing that white can do about it. King moved, rook captured, rook went to h5, protecting the pawn on h3, check, king f2, check. Whenever we're ahead material, I'm more than happy to trade pieces. And now the f-pawn can advance, as the bishop is supporting it. And now the goal is to chase out the white king in front of the pawn. No, I did not blunder my pawn. I gave it up on purpose to then give a discover check, to then win white's rook on h5. My opponent didn't capture it, but moved his king to e3, but this allows my f-pawn to become the hero, even though I didn't push it right away to prevent the white rook coming behind it and checking my king. First I gave a attack to the white rook and controlling the f5 square, and then when the rook would move away someplace, then I'd be ready to push it And even when the king moves to e2, with the help of my bishop, the pawn will get promoted. Well, I hope you learned some lessons from this game of mine that I played in my early years in chess. Learn from the mistakes my opponent made, don't repeat them. On the other hand, try to use some of the ideas on how I took advantage of his mistakes. Thank you for listening and be back next week. I'll share some more chess knowledge with you. Bye bye.